Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Iron Man 2 Iron Man. I wish the sequel actually had that title, Iron Men, because technically, like, it does fit for this film. And, like, Iron Man 3 doesn't have a title either, so, like, it's just Iron Man 3, because why would you come up with, like, an Avengers movie title where it's like Age of Ultron or Endgame or whatever? Like, they had a Goofy come up with titles with those, but in every single, like, Captain America movie had to have a title. Every single Thor movie had to have a title, but, like, Iron Man is just Iron Man 2. Who cares? Everybody else has to have a goofy title. Even Spider-Man had Spider-Man Homecoming. So, here's the thing about this movie. I have to say that this movie is still fun to me. There is not a point where I go through this movie and, like, I'm going through and I'm having to nitpick the crap out of it, or I have to complain about a bunch of stuff. Like, no, I have a positive way of looking at this movie because I've seen the Iron Man movies a plethora of times, and so the only thing that I would say about this movie, as well as like anything that happens after the first Iron Man movie, every single one of these Iron Man films are just passable movies. Like, meaning that to me, it doesn't feel like the stories need to be strong enough because the stories just need to be put out. Like, the stories, like, don't need to be better than its previous thing. It just needs to be a thing. And so we do sue we do sue we do some cool things in the third film, especially when we have like those many Iron Man suits. Like, I do like that. I do enjoy that, where we end up having the big extremis and the Iron Man armor going out and duking it out. That is fun. I like that. I like the many different Iron Man suits. And really, also, we have the aftermath of Avengers in that movie, so we have to make a big, huge, massive film like Avengers was, and so we had to come up with Extremis, and we had to come up with other kind of things in that story, but we'll get there eventually, because I know I'm probably going to get there, because that is also somewhere of a Christmas movie, New Year's, mixture of it all. So, with that said, so these movies are just kind of passable films. Like, I don't think that I would have any high regard of, like, oh my god, I went into Iron Man 2 and what a surprise. Oh, like, I don't think I can ever hate this film. Like, I don't think I can ever hate any Iron Man film, because for the longest time, like, Iron Man, the first film, like, I would have it at some massive high regard compared to any other, like, Superman or superhero films that were to come out. Whereas, like, for the longest time, it's like, well, that's not an Iron Man film. And that was always my real kind of comparison, always was to just be like, well, if it isn't like an Iron Man quality film, then it isn't a good enough Superman or superhero film. What do I keep saying, Superman? So, with that said, let's just go into this. Really, the teeing up variation of this film is we end up having Iron Man, who is to have, of course, this element called palladium into his chest. And so now he's going and drinking odd concoctions like chlorophyll and trying to put cores inside his arc reactor to try and counteract his blood becoming toxic or having a toxicity percentage. And so Iron Man, now realizing that the thing that is to supposedly keep him alive is now killing him, he now has to go on this almost self-destructive journey because he's realizing he's going to die. And so while he's going and doing that, we end up having also people saying like, well, hey, like, the army is going to want to go and take your suits away from you, and somebody's going to be able to sometime soon have this technology, whether it be North Korea or Iran or Hammer Industries at some point. And so we then force our character to not go and like fear for his life because he has finally met his match. No. We have a much more internal struggle where this guy is to realize he's going to die because of all the mistakes that he's made. And so now we're forcing Tony to eventually need someone to lean on, which eventually becomes Rhodey in this film. A completely different Rhodey, because they had to recast it in this sequel movie, because supposedly there was a number of reasons that maybe this like actor wasn't as big of an actor in the sequel movie. There could have been any number of reasons when really looking at it. Maybe there was money problems. Maybe there was like, dude, nobody wants to do this kind of action. Nobody wants to be in this suit. So recast. So with that said, it would have been nice to consistently have the same Rhodey character in this film, but it's too late now. Plus, also, I think the What If series tended to do a lot of recasting so that way we would get the same kind of movie, but with a different character now. So when really looking at it, like, What If corrected some problems that a lot of people have had with the Marvel films. Really, when looking at it, you could come up with a whole, like, how many scenes are really, like, is the original Rhodey really in? Like, they could honestly go through and come up with, hey, here's the slightly different variation cut where you have Rhodey in the movie the whole time and you would never know. They could have done that, like, done a recast during the film and have a completely different Rhodey. They could have done it. Anyways, pushing on, just a little bit of fun because, anyways, like, people could have time to kill to, like, go on and change and drastically change a film. Might as well, right? Like, just do like a face swapping thing or whatever, and have like Don Cheadle say all the words that they could do it. Anyways, so yeah. With that said, let's just go into the double five, because otherwise it's about that time yet again to go into. Oh, but wait a minute. Let's go and talk about the villain in this story, but. Check this movie out on Disney Plus. If you conveniently don't have Disney Plus, then you could go and probably find this movie on a number of movie apps. Search the word in your Google Play Store if you have a mobile device. Search the word movie apps, and you could probably find this movie in a convenient number of a certain kind of bootleggish like apps. But if you go into an app called Play HD TV, you could basically see this movie as well as a number of other things, or you can go on to a Google search and search the word Let Her See Movies. It's one letter and one word, and you can dare, in fact, after you combine these two apps together, to form apps, then, then you can pretty much be able to see dang near anything. So, going into this, how do I feel about the villain of this story? You know what? They actually made a possibly pointless whiplash villain have an actually good story in this film, to where I'm like, yeah, like a whip villain just does kind of seem weird, and really we don't have this like whiplash villain like not heavily used in this film, because again, Tony is going through so much internal struggle that has to be so much of this film, like so viciously focused in this film, that we like don't even have him fight all that often. Like, it's ridiculous how it feels like we have Iron Man 2 and Iron Man 3, where like Iron Man goes and battles a bunch of people and we consistently see him like take down people, but like Tony just justifies it. It's like, well, like I've created peace. I'm your nuclear deterrent. I'm like, so like there isn't much for me to do now because I've basically taken out everybody. And so now basically Tony just has to wait around for Ivan eventually to become a threat once again for Tony, because Tony has nobody to take down here, because he's technically created a world peace until some Avengers level threat comes in, so to speak. So, yeah, I actually like Ivan Vankov, but a whip villain is really goofy, and but I do like the fact that this feels like going right back to creating Ironmonger, and you're basically now creating a character that is to also be Tony's equal, and that's what I can like about this film. Where we kind of go into Extremis is like they just kind of like, well, Extremis is a really popular story, so that's all that really matters. Like, it doesn't matter that we end up having like a character that is to seemingly like be a thing where it's like, oh, they're doing the Mandarin in here? Oh man, that seems really exciting. But then they turn around and then they ruin that character. And I'm just like, God, they wasted a really good Iron Man character and just like made everybody excited about the Mandarin to just flush that down the toilet. And I don't know, it was just like disappointing. And so now let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time we can do spoil Iron Man 2. So we, of course, in the very beginning of this movie, here's the goofy thing. Why is Iron Man going and dropping out of a plane? This man can fly, right? This man can fly, and yet he's going to use a plane to drop out of to like, this makes no sense. Like, you could have just had this guy like fly in, because I'm just scratching my head about this whole beginning that doesn't make sense to me, why he's dropping out of a plane, but it's whatever. So Iron Man drops out of this plane and is to go and do his superhero landing. And so now we have all these Iron Man women that are doing all this choreographed dance, and they're like, oh, yeah, shoot to kill, ACDC, oh yeah. So we now have Iron Man that, of course, has somebody shout out, blow something up. He's like, oh, I already did that. Like, don't heckle me, people. Don't heckle me. So, we, of course, have Iron Man going on, or Tony Stark, going on and mentioning how that he is to like basically like the Age of Ultron quote, peace has created peace in their time, technically. How Uncle Sam could go and sit back and relax because no one has been able to take down Tony in his best day. And so, uh, and from the ashes of captivity, he has risen like the phoenix, and so on and so forth. So, but the main thing here is for Tony to say that the most important thing is what they're to leave behind for the future. And so then he ends up going and letting Howard Stark do this whole presentation about the Stark Expo, and is to go on and rattle off all this stuff. Tony is to go off to check his blood toxicity as he goes and pricks his finger to find out that I think he's at 10% right now, or 20% possibly. And so at one point in this movie, he kind of looks at himself and is like, any other bad ideas? So we then have Tony, who is to go on and have Happy kind of bodyguard him out of this Stark Expo. And a lot of people are, of course, are like news reporters, like, Tony, give us a word about the Stark Expo. Give it to us. Yeah, give us some of that. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, Tony is to see this one kid with this Iron Man helmet, and he's to see Larry King, who's actually Stan Lee, and like he's getting bombarded by all these people. One girl is like saying, "Hey, take my number," and Tony's like, "Okay, sure, yeah." So Tony then goes off to his car to all of a sudden get subpoenaed by some girl, and so Tony is to ask her to show the badge, which of course she does. She's like, "Still like it?" And he's like, "Yep." So Tony is to now have to forcibly go to, I believe, Washington, D.C. to go and, of course, have Senator Stern go and now put together a court hearing for Tony to have to surrender his Iron Man armor because it is to for how Senator Stern is to think that the Iron Man armor is not in good hands with Tony Stark, to where they're wanting to take it away from him. Plus, also, now that Tony has created this thing, all of a sudden there might be some people that are to follow here. And so, plus, we can have them worry, especially because of what happened with the very first Iron Man movie, where Obadiah Stane was going and selling Stark Industry weapons under the table without Tony realizing this. And so now Tony is to eventually have to debate here that nobody else is going to get his technology. No one else is going to be able to take this away from him because the suit and him are one. So, and he can't go on and have them like force this suit to, or force Tony to do this Iron Man thing because he doesn't want to be prostituted out or have some kind of slave labor of sorts. So anyways, we have, of course, Hammer that comes out and is to mention that uh, that he is to be the specialist here, that is to go on and kind of counter debate what Tony is trying to say here. And Hammer, and so Tony is to say that Hammer is to be your, like, your specialist, like your intelligence here. And so Hammer is like, you know what, like, you know what, I'm no real uh like specialist here. I'm no real like scientist here. You know who the real guy was? That was that guy? Like your father, Howard Stark. So we end up having Hammer kind of putting up this big show and dance, but then Rhodey ends up coming in. And so now Rhodey is to have documented Tony Stark being Iron Man through a statement. And so Rhodes has gone on to repeat what he had said in some statement back into this hearing. And then Rhodey is to, of course, not say anything more than that. But they're to say that supposedly there is a number of other places that are to create a Iron Man like suit. North Korea, Iran, and Hammer Industries are very close. But here's the thing, they don't actually show what's actually going on in there. And so Tony is to commandeer the screens to showcase exactly what's going on in there, because he, of course, easily knows because he keeps track of this. So he had found out that North Korea and in Iran and Hammer Industries are nowhere close to coming up with a Iron Man suit. Maybe 10 years from now, maybe Hammer Industries 20 years from now. And so Tony is his nuclear, or their nuclear deterrent, and he's done debating with them because there is nothing like this out there, because Tony has had proof. So he's done talking with these people. He wants to be Secretary of Defense, and if they could afford him. And so he ends up calling them ASS clowns, and Senator Stern tells him to basically F off. So Tony goes on and is, of course, to have this news report where he is to mention that he is to pleasure himself and this and that. So now, in the very beginning of this movie, we of course have to remember the I am Iron Man speech that Tony Stark is to give in the very first movie, where of course he is to mention that his laundry list of character defects would easily make people rationally assume that he would never be a superhero, and so on and so forth, and all this stuff that he rattles off. And so Ivan is going on and watching this interview back, where Tony Stark is to reveal he's Iron Man. And so all of a sudden we have Ivan, who is talking to Anton, his father, mentioning that Anton is to say that should have been Ivan. That should have been him there instead of Tony Stark, because he was equally the guy that it came up with the arc reactor with Howard Stark, but then Howard Stark was to realize that Anton just wanted to make money off of it, and Howard Stark didn't want to do that, so Howard basically buried Anton for him to go off and live a vodka-fueled rage for X amount of years until finally he was to die. So Anton was to finally, of old age, die off. And so Ivan is going on and taking all the blueprints from Anton and Howard's arc reactor that now Ivan is turning around and creating a somewhat similar arc reactor that Tony is to have to eventually then create this, of course, whipping-like weapon. So we have, of course, Ivan going and taking some, I guess, some black market or some kind of weird, goofy passport so he can make his way into where Tony eventually is going to be at some part of this movie. So we then have, of course, Tony making it back to of course, his place. And so we end up having Tony, of course, changing out his arc reactor, changing out his core. And so that's when Tony is to be drinking the chlorophyll, and Tony's asking, like, Jarvis how much he has to drink of this to kind of counterbalance what's going on in his system. So Tony then is getting an update from Jarvis, and Potts is to make her way down, and so Tony's like, mute. So Potts comes in and is to tell Tony the everyday stuff of what he had done and what he should be doing and so on and so forth. We have Tony, who is to give off his certain artwork to some Scouts of America, and Potts is angry about that because she had taken like a ton of time to have to go through and sort through all that just for Tony to just give that away somewhere. So we go on and we have, of course, Potts talking about Wind Farm, and and Tony's like, hey, don't even talk about Wind Farm. I'm feeling a little gassy. And so we have Tony, who is to all of a sudden see this Iron Man painting, and so he is to go and take this one expensive painting down to replace it with this Iron Man painting. Is like, man, what a work of art. So we have Tony that's sick of this day-to-day stuff that Potts has to berate him with. So he's like, you know what? Like, I'm going to make you the CEO of my company. And Potts isn't even listening to him. And so she keeps rattling off about more important things for him to do. And he's like, no, like, you're going to be my CEO. Stop preventing me from doing this and just do it. Like, I thought it would have been a lot more difficult to like come up with my successor, but it's really not. Like, to where he's kind of like dubbing her like, you are now my CEO. Run my business. I don't care. Like, I'm not going to go and do this garbage anymore. So we then turn around and, of course, have Potts, who is to put paperwork together to have, of course, Tony sign his company over. And so Tony is going on and boxing it with Happy. And now we might quite possibly see the number of sponsors that are to be in this scene, as well as probably a number of sponsors that were probably in Monaco with the whole Grand Prix thing, where they probably slipped some sponsors in there somewhere, probably also. So, but yeah, I'm really just kind of curious how many like massive number of sponsors were actually possibly in this film. Could you count them all? So, while of course Potts is going and having uh, Tony sign his company away, we then also are to be introduced to Natalie, who's actually Natasha Romanov. So we end up, of course, having Potts and Tony go and talk about Natalie, finding out that she's a model and all kinds of things. And Potts is like, this is a harassment lawsuit waiting to happen. And so Natalie goes in to supposedly get some training lessons from Happy on how to fight. And so Happy is saying it's like, oh, like, where did you get your fighting practice from? Some booty boot camp somewhere or some goofy little thing? So Happy goes and is to try and hit Natasha just for her to easily go and take him down. I think she like head scissors him, or she like Hurricane Rana's him, but like either way, like she ends up just taking him down. And like Potts is like, Happy. So we end up having, of course, Tony's like, I want one of those. He wants Natalie, which he'll find out is Natasha. So we transition from this spot to, of course, having Tony go to Monaco for this Grand Prix because his he is to have a car in this race. And so, but we also have Tony, of course, making his way through some kind of waters here. We have Elon Musk, who is to make a cameo in the scene, and I never realized this until actually now that Elon Musk is in this scene. I'm like, so man, like, yeah, like Elon Musk, like, I guess this does make sense to have like certain guys that are to have these like Fortune 500 whatever companies and whatever, like an actual person that is to be like an actual guy just be in this movie somewhere. So Tony is to tell Potts just like, hey, like, whatever happens, just go with whatever happens for the next 20 minutes here. Because Tony is to have Natalie come to Monaco to be his assistant. So, but that also has Tony bump right back into Hammer, who is going on and talking to the reporter from the very first Iron Man film. So we go on and we have Tony again, who is to check his toxicity levels. And so he then decides to go on and find where his racer is racing in the Grand Prix and decides that he is going to say that, well, hey, like, what's the point of having a race car if you don't drive it? And so Tony is replacing his driver, going on and racing the Grand Prix. And so we have Ivan, who is to make his way, disguising himself as some pit crew, to go through the Grand Prix and then eventually whip out his costume and whips to go through and slice through these race cars in half until he can go to find Tony Stark, rip his, of course, race car in half, which now causes Happy to show, of course, Potts the briefcase Iron Man suit, and Potts is like, okay, we gotta go. So Happy and Potts are to make their way onto this racetrack, which I can't really believe that, but it happened. So we of course have Tony trying to defend himself until Happy is to go and ram right into Ivan and keep like ramming into him multiple times, where then Tony is desperately calling for the suit. Give me the suit, give me the suit. And so we keep having this like back and forth part with the car, and they're like, oh my god. So Ivan starts tearing through the car like it's Swiss cheese, with his whips. And then finally, Tony is to go the other way around, like, hey, give me the suit, chuck it at me. And so Tony ends up getting the suitcase suit, and so now he's to, of course, end up putting the suit on. And you know what? I really like this, like, silver and red kind of suit. Some people may not like it, some people may not care for this one. Like, I wish that they would have actually kept this kind of color with, like, the silver and red. Like, I think it would have made a lot of sense if we had, like, a silver and red Iron Man suit to look similar to War Machine's silver and, like, charcoal, or whatever that color is, the darker gray. So we now have Tony Stark in the Mark V suit. So we of course have Tony, who is to go and get whipped by the suit, and we have Whiplash, who's thinking like, I gotcha. But then all of a sudden Tony is to like wrap the, like, kind of duck over and like and to just kind of hug onto these whips and then go on and take out Whiplash and to knock him out. And so we then have Whiplash getting dragged away, calling, like, Tony, you're a wuss! and all this jazz. So Tony is to go on and meet with Ivan in a prison cell. And so they end up saying that this guy is to evidently not speak English to anybody. And so we, of course, have Tony wanting to speak with him for 5 minutes, and so they allow that. Weirdly, just some random guy, some random Tony Stark, and a guy that Ivan wanted to kill is to now go and interrogate this guy without any kind of concern of like, oh yeah, like he can probably go and kill somebody. What if Iron Man gives him some kind of tech to escape out of here? Maybe they are friends after all, who knows? like it's kind of this Spider-Man thing where you would think like J. Jonah Jameson would always say like, "Oh, they're working together." How do you know they're not working together? So Tony goes on and is to talk to Ivan, and so we have it where Ivan is to say that he technically won, and Tony's like, "How could you have won? Like, yeah, you had your shot. Like your tech is kind of like you could have kind of gone and done certain routes and made it a lot better, but so we end up having Ivan go on and say that he has made God bleed, and that everybody will start to lose trust in him, and that there's blood in the water and sharks are coming. And so, like, what Ivan had done here, like, doesn't mean that he won't be able to not do it again. So, we also have, of course, Ivan talking about the palladium in the chest, horrible way to die. And so we have Tony who is to say, it's like, well, hey, like, you had your shot and you lost, and like, and now you're gonna watch me um, from the privacy of a jail cell walk out of here. Uh, so we then turn around and we have Ivan who is to have Hammer go on and watch Ivan almost take Tony out. And so Hammer is to go and give Ivan the ability to escape this prison. So Ivan has a guy that is to be some look-alike, which, funny enough, we see the same guy in this cell also in Iron Man 3. I think right around the scene where they're to go on and have Tony be like calling for his Iron Man armor, and only his hand shows up because it's gonna take a while for all of it to get there. So, but it's the same guy weirdly. So we have this guy who ends up going into this prison, and the mashed potatoes are to be set up as this bomb. The food that, of course, Ivan is to get is some way of helping Ivan get the heck out of there. So we have Ivan who takes down this one guard to go on to have some sheet being put over his head, and is to go on to some plane to be sent off to make his way to Hammer Industries. And so Ivan is to meet with Hammer, and so we have Hammer going on and explaining that, like, hey, like, I think you knew a guy like me would be watching you go and take down Tony, and so yeah, like, I'm really impressed, and like, I want a guy like you on my team. And so Ivan, of course, goes and starts speaking Russian, and so we have like Hammer who's like, "Do you not understand English? Like, we can get a translator in here." And then Ivan's like, "Very good, man." I'm like, "Oh yeah, yeah, very good, man, yeah." So we now have, of course, Hammer and Ivan, like, we have a team up here. So we now have Ivan asking for his bird, and we have Hammer's like, "Hey, I can get you 10 birds." Like, and he's like, "No, my bird." And he's like, well, it doesn't seem like all that impossible. So Ivan goes on and is to show the kind of the rough drafts of what they're trying to do there with these suits. And so Ivan goes through and breaks through their firewall and is to say that their software is crap. And so he goes on to rip this helmet off. And so Hammer's like, God, that like costs so much money to do. So we have Ivan who gives, of course, Ivan a bird, and he's like, "That's not my bird." And they're like, "Well, yeah, it's a bird from Russia." It's like, so because we, of course, have weirdly just Hammer like flying in things from like several places, like unique ice creams and all kinds of things, like organic ice cream and stuff. So we then go on to have Rhodes making his way to Tony to talk to him, to say, hey man, now that Ivan is to have this technology that's very similar to yours, now the government is up in arms and are now going to want to break through your house to go and take these suits from you. And Tony's like, well, they can try, kind of thing. So Tony is struggling getting out of his hot rod, and he is to have Rhodey take him to this desk. And so now Tony, of course, is taking out his arc reactor to take out this core part, and Rhodey's like, should that be smoking like that? And so Tony is kind of giving Rhodes the rundown of kind of what's going on with him. And so he ends up putting this core back into his chest. And Tony's also saying that he's running through these cores a lot quicker. And so we now have Rhodes going on and taking a phone call saying that Iron Man will be back on watch within the next day and trying to kind of look after Tony. And so Tony is realizing that he's going to die soon. And so we have Natalie, who is to go on and bring certain alcoholic beverages to Tony because it's his birthday and he's going to have a party. And so Tony is to ask Natalie if like it's really good to have a party right now, like if it's in poor taste or whatever. And so we have where Tony's to ask Natalie, what would you do if this was your last birthday? And Natalie's mentioned to kind of like share it with one person and one person only. So Tony goes off to this party dressed in his Iron Man suit, and we go on and we seem to have him very drunk to where he's peeing in his own suit. And so we now have, of course, him going on and shooting champagne bottles and watermelons and so on and so forth. And so we have this DJ going and doing this this whole thing. And I think the one thing that we take away from this movie is this DJ was to sadly pass away after this movie was over, which is like, oh, that's too bad, but it's probably just a weird, goofy coincidence. So, or whatever. It's just like, hey, just like this just so happened to be his big break, and then he died after that. So we now have Tony going too far, and Potts is to want to stop this party. And Tony's like, well, yeah, like the party for me was over like an hour and a half ago. The after party is now starting. And so that just makes Rhodes go off to get the Mark II armor and come back in to now tell everybody to get the heck out of here and for Tony to shut his suit down. And now Tony is going like, hey, DJ AM, like, give me some fat beats to beat up my friend. So now we have both Tony and we have Rhodes fighting it out. And so eventually we go on and we have them continue to fight, throwing weight plates at one another and kind of barbells and all kinds of stuff. And so we end up having them kind of getting chucked into a fireplace and all kinds of things kind of going down in this film. So the very big part of this is that eventually Tony is to tell Rhodes to go and take his shot. He wants to be a war machine, take his shot. And so both of them eventually go and fire their repulsors to then create this big thing that pushes both of them back. And so we end up realizing that this weapon that they're going to use to combine together is going to be the thing to just wipe out the villain at the end of the movie. Because if we really don't have Whiplash having a big enough fight out with Tony in this movie, then we just turn around and just like we just don't have a lot of like good enough fight scenes in this movie because again, Tony and his internal struggle. So we then push on and are to have Tony the very next day at Randy's Donuts. So Tony is to mention that he is hungover, and he's not really sure what he's seeing anymore, because of course he's seeing Nick Fury. Nick Fury is telling Tony to exit from the donut, and so Tony is to tell Fury that he doesn't want to be a part of his super secret boy band, and I kind of like that line. That line's really funny. So we have, of course, Nick just kind of frustrated with Tony on how Rhodey had just taken one of Tony's suits and told him it's like, well, hey, like you're Iron Man, and he took it, and so all of a sudden we end up finding out that Natalie is actually Natasha Romanov, who's actually a S.H.I.E.L.D. operative, and now here's the big reveal. And so we, of course, have Natalie going and injecting Tony with this thing to help him kind of even out. And so Tony is telling Natasha, like, well, hey, can you not do something, like, awful for, like, 10 seconds? So Tony is to just mention that if he's kind of given those injections plenty of enough times, that he'll probably feel right as rain. And so Fury instead is telling Tony, it's like, well, hey, like, your father had come up with the solution, but we don't know where it actually is. And so you're going to have to go and figure that out. You're going to have to go through a number of old footage of your father's and try to figure something out that we didn't. Because Howard was to have the answer. And You know what? It would have been nice if in the movie Endgame we'd have actually had Howard kind of like just researching this or coming up with this kind of answer, and like it gives us a look back at Iron Man 2 in Endgame, but like I guess we just don't get there. Or I guess it really doesn't matter for Endgame to re-bring that up. So we then go on and have Tony, who is to be forced to be home. He's on house arrest. And we have Coulson, who's kind of keeping watchful eye on Tony and giving him all of his father's research. And so Tony is mentioning that he wants to go and get some some body work done, and that he's going to go on and do several other things. And Coulson's like I don't care what you do as long as you do it here. Like I am willing to eventually go on and taser you and watch Super Nannies while you drool on the carpet. Like I don't care what you do as long as you do it here. So Tony then goes on and is to watch old footage of his father and have these kind of like blooper reels of his dad going on and talking about the thing that he talked about in the Stark Expo. But then all of a sudden, like, we end up having finally Howard, who is to have this video that doesn't quite make sense to have this video in all these blooper reels, where all of a sudden Howard is to go on and say that his greatest achievement is Tony. And that also that there was actually something here in the Stark Expo model that Tony eventually needs to figure out. So we then go on and have, of course, Tony that is to make his way to Potts, where consistently Potts is going throughout this movie and is having to do damage control, going and talking to the press, or going on to talk to certain news channels, or going on to talk to certain things of some kind, doing some kind of damage control for Tony. And so Tony is to come to Potts and bring her what he thinks is a peace offering, which is strawberries. And Potts is to tell Tony, it's like, well, you do realize I have one thing that I'm allergic to, and that's the one thing that you brought me. And he's like, oh, strawberries. Like, I knew there was some correlation with you and these strawberries, but I didn't know exactly what it was. So Tony's going on and trying to talk to Potts, but there is consistent times where he is to mention the word I, and so Potts eventually is to stop Tony from talking because he has said I far too often. So we have Natalie show up, we have Happy show up, and they're both working for Potts. And so Tony's like, oh, like I guess I lost both of the kids in the divorce. And Happy's like, just don't say it. So we end up having, of course, Tony also asking Natalie, excuse me for a second. Tony is asking Natalie if she, of course, is to be integrating really well in working with Potts, and Natalie's going and speaking Latin to her, or speaking Latin to Tony, and because Tony is, of course, to ask, like, Natalie, does she even speak Latin? Because that was on her resume. And I'm like, of course she speaks Latin. Because going into any Conjuring movie, it seems like if you have any supernatural things, like you have to speak Latin eventually for some weird, goofy reason. And I'm sure Natalie had to learn all of the dead languages that nobody really knows, but it seems like there's always some important book that's always done in Latin for whatever goofy reason. So, Tony then goes on after talking to Potts, and she's still mad at him. And so, Tony goes and takes the model of his dad's expo, and is now go on and have Jarvis go and make a copy of the buildings and kind of put it up for display for him to see, like, where Howard was to keep some kind of secret somewhere. And so we eventually have Tony figure out that Howard was to element in the globe of this model, the Earth, the globe. And so Howard is to realize that, or Tony's to realize that Howard had put this element in this globe, and he's like, oh my god, like, my dad's dead, but he's still taking me to school. So Tony then comes up with all these goofy things in his home to eventually go and create this element and create this new arc reactor, and then is to go and put it inside of his body so that way he can taste coconut and metal. But, so, we have, of course, the spot where Coulson is to come in with the Captain America prototype shield and is to kind of place it underneath this one piece for Tony. And so Coulson is to go on and tell Tony that Coulson is to go off to New Mexico, and Tony's like, oh, the land of enchantment. And so Coulson, of course, is going off to New Mexico to go and find Mjolnir and go on to like quarantine that whole place off and go and be in the Thor movie. Like, I didn't remember which Iron Man movie it was that had Mjolnir in the end credits scene. Like, I didn't know if it was the Iron Man movie or it was like Iron Man 2, because I know in Iron Man 1 we have Nick Fury come in and kind of set up the whole like Avengers thing. But then like Iron Man 2, like I was thinking, does this set up like the whole Mjolnir thing? Anyways, so we then go on to have now Hammer eventually going and finding out that Ivan has put together drones instead of suits. And so we of course have Ivan and Justin going on and saying the words like, hey, like, don't hold on to certain things, learn to let go. And we have, of course, Ivan going on and speaking Russian to Justin, and Justin's like, I don't know this, but I don't speak Russian. So we just have Justin, who gets more and more frustrated with Ivan, with him kind of doing this whole runaround act with first these drones, And then Ivan goes on and says that he is to have these suits. And so, luckily for Hammer, Rhodey is to bring in the Mark II Iron Man suit in to this army base to have them weaponize it, to have Hammer weaponize it, for him to have something to show off at this expo. And so we then go on, and I think at one point Potts is going and talking about the Iron Man Mark II suit and how technically they should not go on and tamper with it, but it seems like they're going to do this anyways. So we then push on and have, of course, Vankoff, who goes and is to call Tony. And we have, of course, where Tony's like, well, hey, like, you sound pretty well for a dead man. And Ivan's like, well, yeah, like, I'm going to do a little bit more than that. Now I'm going to do a little bit more than talking. So Ivan is to mention that the 40 years that he has technically, the things that he has done to Ivan's family, Ivan is going to turn around and do the same thing to Tony and his family in 40 minutes. So we have Tony, who's trying to track where the phone is, or the phone call is coming to. And so we have, of course, Tony, who is to realize that Hammer is working for Ivan. And so Tony is to make his way to the expo. And so we, of course, have Justin Hammer going out, doing his little dance, a little juck and jive, to then do this expo where he is, of course, going and showcasing the several different drones, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines, all these kinds of drones. Then he, of course, is to finish it off with War Machine. And we had Justin, who is to go to Ivan with his, like, runaround kind of thing, and so they end up taking his shoes away from him and saying, like, you know what? Like, I would be at the mercy of you tonight if I didn't have this sweet expo that I'm going to have. Or I'm probably going to go there, and I'm probably going to get laid and all these kinds of things. So they go on and do this War Machine thing, and all of a sudden Iron Man is to pop in, do his superhero pose again, and is to tell Rhodey, it's like, hey, like, Ivan's still alive, and Ivan and Hammer are working together. So Tony is asking Hammer where Ivan is, and so all of a sudden we end up finding out that all of Hammer's tech is getting hacked into, War Machine is getting hacked into. So because Hammer is to go in and put in a different assortment of guns inside of Rhodey's War Machine. And he is to, of course, put in the ex-wife. And as well as Puff the Magic Dragon and all kinds of other goofy things. So we go on and have Rhodey as well as these other drones all getting controlled. Everybody is scramblingly trying to get out of here because they don't want to get killed off by these drones. So eventually Tony is to desperately try to figure out a way to take all these drones out. And so eventually Tony is to ask Jarvis to hack into Rhodey's War Machine so he can kind of get him back to help him out to take all these drones out. So we now have Natasha, who is to be driven by Happy to Hammer's Hammer Industries because she is to find out from Ivan what's going on, and so she scrambles to go to Hammer Industries to eventually reset Rhodey and then talk to Tony, where Tony is to divulge that he was going to die at some point. And Potts is to find out, like, oh, hey, you were going to die? You were dying? And then Tony was like, well, I was going to explain it, but, like, but I just didn't have time. I was gonna have you, like, take an omelet and whatever, and explain it to you because we had Tony who was on this plane trying to make some food with Potts, and he was going on and saying, like, hey, we should take a retreat, we should recharge our batteries, and Potts is like, well, we don't all run on batteries like you do, Tony. So we go on and we have Tony who's busy fighting a hemorrhoid attack, so we end up having Rhodey who ends up getting reset, and Rhodey, of course, is like, you can have your suit back. And we, of course, have War Machine when he wasn't having any kind of control. He was telling Tony, like, giving him a heads up of, like, he's targeting you. In the scramble of it all. So we have Rhodey saying, like, hey, you can have your suit back. And so now they're all of a sudden in the kill zone, which is the worst place to be. And so we had them kind of gearing up to take down all these drones. So they end up going on and blasting through all these drones, and then Tony ends up using his one-off. And so Rhodes is like, hey, you should have led with that. And Tony's like, I can't because it's a one-off, boss. So now we end up having Whiplash coming in here in his suit. And so we have them getting pretty beaten up for a good while until they end up realizing that it's like, hey, like, hey, Rhodey, do you want to be a sidekick? Like, hey, man, do you want to hands out, hands in? So Rhodey's like, seriously, are we doing this again? And Tony's like, yep. So they end up, of course, using their repulsors and make this big blast to go ahead and wipe out Whiplash. And so we then I completely forgot about the whole, like, I didn't even mention the whole. Natalie went on to go through Hammer Industries and take out all these guys, all these numerous guys, and Happy could have only taken out one of them. And so, and then she ends up making it to Rhodey's resetting thing. So we, after this whole thing is resolved and that Whiplash, as well as all the rest of his drones, are to self-destruct here, and now Tony is to quickly make it to Potts and grab her and get to this rooftop where she is to mention, it's like, you know what, I think I quit. Like, I don't know if you're gonna die or like destroy the whole company. Like, I don't know anymore. And so we end up having, of course, Potts resigning here. And so Tony's like, okay, you resign, effective immediately. And so we end up having them like kissing here. And so all of a sudden, like, War Machine is to be there. And so Potts is to say, oh yeah, I did resign. And Rhodey's like, I heard everything. Like, it's okay. So we have Rhodey, who is to, of course, go on and leave, keeping the suit because his car blew up in the explosion. So he's gonna go and take his suit, whether Tony wants it to happen or not. So we then turn around and have Tony, who's going and talking to Fury, and so Fury is to go on and give Tony Natasha's assessment of him. And so we have him going on and mentioning that he's a narcissist and that he is to be all these other things. And so he's like, well, hey, I was dying. And so we have Iron Man, who is to go on and be a part of this thing, but Tony Stark, no. And so he's like, well, how can you pick me, but not pick me? And so we go on and we have Tony, who's like, well, hey, it seems like we're going to have an award ceremony coming up soon. And you know what? Like, since I did save the world yet again, how about you do one thing for me? And Fury's like, name it. And so they have this award ceremony where Senator Stern is giving both Tony and Rhodey this award and saying that Rhodey deserves it, but Tony is to be, of course, a little prick. And so we, of course, have Senator Stern going on and like going in for a photo op, and Tony like delivers the piece, which is to be kind of a re-reference from the first Iron Man film. And so yeah, this is kind of how this movie just kind of finishes up. And so we then end up, of course, having the end credits scene in New Mexico with the Mjolnir, and like that's basically how this movie just ends. So, with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody. Like, man, it's kind of so weird to, one, go back into these much older Marvel movies, but two, it's just kind of, like, weird, like, having X amount of minutes of movie, and I feel like I can talk about them, and a lot of times I would never think that I would be able to have, like, retained much of this stuff, because really I would think that I would never remember most of this movie, hence why I would always not want to go into it, because I would think it would be too complicated of a thing to try to accomplish, or I would just think that, like, yeah, there's no way, like, I'm going to be biting off more than I can chew here. But then I find out that I'm like, you know what, F it, like, I've done like Infinity Wars and Endgames and all these heavily complicated movies, and I figured out a way to just come out of them like unscathed and be able to say most of the stuff that happens in the film. Not always all, because like I always want to protect myself and just like, yeah, there's always some crevice of something that I forgot about, or some line of dialogue that would probably be very important or fun to somebody, and that was the one thing that I didn't mention. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody. Yeah, like, this is a fun but just passable movie. It's just like a movie that I would just say like everybody is eventually going to see, possibly at some point, because it's just rolls into that MCU where you always feel like you have to see freaking everything when you get into a latest movie. And so it's kind of hard to really figure out what exactly you should be watching when you're going to go into a Spider-Man No Way Home movie, or you're going into any number of other freaking things at this point. Like, should I watch every single Spider-Man film? Should I watch every single whatever movie? And so on and so forth. So, with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.